This idea of Thucydides Trap is very much a product of European history, which is full of military conquests and based on this mentality of zero-sum game. If I'm stronger, I should beat you, But this is really not part of the Chinese historical legacies. If you look at Chinese history over the past 2,000 years or even longer, essentially the theme of Chinese philosophy, especially Confucianism, is about this you may call harmony in diversity, or in today's word, win-win, peaceful coexistence. So really, the world is so large, we can find, increased, expanded interest of cooperation, where we can, both countries, rising power and status quo power can benefit.
Well, one thing that a lot of people in the West do not seem to understand is China's obsession with this kind of relationship, or the acknowledgement of the US side about the content of a new type of relationship China wants to forge with the United States, namely the four characteristics we have been hearing: the no conflict, no confrontation, mutual respect, and win-win. Why is it so important for China to hear these principles from the United States?
I think these ideas and principles are crucial. No conflict, no confrontation, win-win cooperation, and mutual respect. As we look at history, indeed, major powers do have conflicts of interest, and sometimes they go into wars with each other. But if we have these four principles established and guide our relations, bilateral relations between China and the United States, so we can usher in really a new era of globalization, new era, a new phase of Sino-US relations, which will be hugely beneficial not only to the Chinese people, the American people, but also to the world at large.
Well, Donald Trump has been advocating America first, while Chinese President Xi Jinping has been promoting the concept of the China dream since 2012, calling for a great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Do you think the dreams of the two countries have common ground, that we can achieve these dreams together without I win, you lose, this kind of scenario?
On the one hand, I do have some sympathy for President Trump, and after all, if we look at the statistics, indeed, many Americans failed to achieve the American dreams over the past 2 decades. And so he has to take care of some of the interests of his constituencies. Yet I do believe these American dreams and the Chinese dreams can be complementary, can be made complementary. If you look at the Sino-US trade as an example, I remember when I was first visiting the United States over 3 decades ago, Sino-US trade was roughly $6 billion. Now it's closer to $600 billion, 100-fold increase. Just imagine how many Americans, how many Chinese have realized their dreams in this process of 100-fold increase. For core, I'm pretty sure that that's the case. We can continue to build on this existing strong economic relations and try to make it better and create more interests for both peoples. Just look at the American companies. So many companies have benefited for their investment in China. And many of them actually have created more profits in China than in the United States.
Well, one of the things that the Trump administration has been accusing China is that American companies have not benefited enough or as much as Chinese companies have benefited while doing business in the US, for instance. And that is why trade and economic issue is said to be a key issue on the agenda for the two presidents. According to a senior US administration official, and I quote, the US wants to work with the Chinese in a constructive manner to reduce the systematic trade and investment barriers being created by China that has led to an uneven playing field for US companies. Is there this kind of systematic barrier in your eyes?
No, I think perhaps the American audience should also hear the Chinese side of the story. From the Chinese point of view, at least from my point of view, this systematic barrier, if there were, the United States has certain responsibility, if not a major responsibility for. In other words, you look at trade, for instance, China hopes to buy a lot of things from the United States, but the United States still impose a lot of restrictions on what China can buy, what China cannot buy, especially in high-tech sector. Indeed, this trade deficit, to my mind, can be overcome overnight if the United States is more generous in terms of allowing Chinese companies to buy whatever they want to buy. Same with investment. You just look at the, say, the case of Apple and the Chinese company Huawei. I do think the Chinese company like Huawei has encountered more difficulties in accessing US market, while US company like Apple encountered less difficulty in entering the Chinese market. Actually, many US companies have made such a huge amount of profits. You know, they made more profits here in China than in the United States, than in other markets. Take General Motors as an example. Actually, its investment in China really helped to save its operations in the United States. Yeah.
Reality is reality. However, perception is perception, people would argue. And I think a lot of the problems right now is arising from the kind of misperceptions the US public has about China's economy, about China's growing status, or about what China tries to do in the future. How do you think President Xi can persuade President Trump during their meeting to understand that reality and perception is not the same thing, and that the two countries can really sit down and work on some of these toughest issues you've just mentioned?
Yeah. In many ways, this meeting between the two leaders hopefully can set a tone for the coming 4 years of the bilateral relation between two countries, especially in the field of trade and economic matters. I do believe it's possible. For instance, I'm thinking of this controversy over different, you know, who gains more, who gains less. Ideally, I think we should pursue this win-win approach. In other words, we try to have a positive balance rather than facing the existing pie, which is fixed in size. Who will cut which part, who will cut which part is bigger. Let's build and create a bigger pie and then discuss how to share. So both sides will gain from this. So this positive balance is a great idea for bilateral trade relations and investment relations.
Well, another urgent issue facing these two leaders is the DPRK nuclear issue. President Donald Trump has again talked tough while accepting an interview before the meeting to the Financial Times, saying if China does not rein in Pyongyang, the United States would do it alone. And at the same time, the DPRK has just tested another medium-range ballistic missile. How do you think China and United States can find compromise on the DPRK issue during this 24-hour meeting?
I think, you know, the Chinese position is very clear. China is strongly opposed to nuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. China is also opposed to any acts of war in the Korean Peninsula. And indeed, I think you have to look at the situation on the Korean Peninsula. What I see as a Chinese scholar is a situation where you have South Korea, United States still maintain this Cold War stance against North Korea. And ideally, if you look at the situation on the Korean Peninsula, China and North Korea have already evolved into a post-Cold War relationship. So perhaps we should all strive for post-Cold War relationship in which we should really make this armistice agreement, which is essentially ceasefire agreement, turn this into a peace treaty, without which North Korea will have a strong sense of insecurity. So this is a fundamental approach.
Do you think there is any possibility for President Donald Trump and President Xi during this very short meeting to have some kind of general agreement or general consensus on where to go in the future on this issue?
I'm not very sure. Ideally, they can find consensus or agreement on this whole issue of the Korean Peninsula and nuclearization, etc. Yet it's not all that easy. After all, this is their first meeting. It's not that long. Perhaps they can. This meeting can help them to get to know each other, and hopefully to strike a personal relationship. This is already good for maintaining good relation between China and the United States and for regional peace.
Yeah, but in the overall development of US-China relations, how would you describe the significance of this meeting, the first ever between President Xi and President Donald Trump, and in the very informal atmosphere?
No, I think it's important. You know, I try to summarize this relationship at this particular stage or this particular event as a sign of what I call from uncertainty to certainty, or at least to a measured degree of certainty. If you look at the election campaign in the United States, so much campaign rhetoric against China, and people have a lot of uncertainty about the future of Sino-US relations. But now we see the two leaders meet each other in a friendly atmosphere, in the summer resort of the US president, very casually, informally, and chatting with each other. I think all these are good signs which provides the minimum degree of certainty that the two countries and their relationship are roughly under control or even in reasonably good order. So this is crucial. This message is important for China, for the United States, for the world at large.